The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like angry wasps as I clutched my chest, feeling each heartbeat echo through my ribs like thunder. 12 hours. 12 long, agonizing hours I sat in that emergency room chair, watching strangers come and go while I remained invisible, forgotten, abandoned by the very person who had promised to love my family as her own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maria Gonzalez, and I'm 73 years old. I raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband died when I was just 42. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, cleaned offices on weekends, and sold homemade tamales at the local market just to keep food on our table. I sacrificed everything so my children could have better lives than I did. I thought I had succeeded, especially with my youngest son, Carlos. But that night in the emergency room, staring at the institutional clock that seemed frozen in time, I realized that sometimes the people we love most are capable of the deepest betrayals. Sometimes the family we build with our own hands can crumble with just one phone call, one moment of crisis, one test of character that reveals who someone really is beneath their carefully constructed facade. This is my story. It's about trust betrayed, love tested, and the shocking discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about the woman who married my son. It's about what happens when desperation strips away all pretense, and how, sometimes the most painful truths come wrapped in the most unexpected revelations. The pain started during my evening novena, just as I was lighting the candle for my late husband, Roberto. I had been kneeling in front of our small altar in the living room, the same altar where I had prayed every night for 31 years. Since his passing, when suddenly it felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around my chest and pulled them tight. I tried to breathe, tried to call out, but the words caught in my throat like dry leaves. The candle flickered in my trembling hand as I struggled to my feet, knocking over the small framed photograph of Roberto in his army uniform. The glass cracked across his smiling face, and somehow that felt like an omen, though I couldn't say, of what. My phone was in the kitchen, and those 20 steps felt like 20 miles. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a drum of panic in my ears. I managed to dial Carlos first, my youngest, the one who lived closest, the one who had always been my baby even though he was now 38 years old and married. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I could hear laughter in the background when he finally answered, the sound of television and conversation, the comfortable noise of a family evening that I was about to shatter. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Carlos asked, and I could hear the immediate concern in his voice. He had always been intuitive that way, able to read the worry in my silence even as a child. "Carlos, mijo, I think something's wrong with my heart," I managed to whisper, each word an effort. "The pain, it's so strong." "Oh my God, Mommy. Okay. Don't panic. We're coming right now. Lucia and I will be there in 10 minutes. Don't move. Don't do anything. Just sit down and wait for us." I heard him calling to his wife in the background, his voice urgent but trying not to frighten her. "Lucia, we need to go to my mom's right now. Something's wrong with her heart. Can you drive?" My hands are shaking. Even through my pain, I felt a flutter of gratitude. My daughter-in-law, Lucia, had always been so composed in emergencies, so practical and efficient. When Carlos's father-in-law had his stroke 2 years ago, she had handled everything with such grace, coordinating with doctors, managing medications, making sure everyone knew what was happening. I remembered thinking then how lucky Carlos was to have married someone so capable, so caring. They arrived in 8 minutes, which meant Lucia had driven faster than she should have through our quiet neighborhood. I heard the car doors slam, and Carlos's key in the lock, and then they were both there, filling my small living room with their presence and their worry. "Ay, Mommy, you're so pale," Carlos said, kneeling beside my chair and taking my hand. His palm was warm and steady, so different from Roberto's hands, which had always been rough from construction work, but with the same gentle strength. Lucia was already moving efficiently around the room, gathering my purse, my insurance cards, my list of medications that I kept taped to the refrigerator. She had changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even in crisis, she looked put together, professional. "The emergency room at St. Mary's is closest," she said, not really asking, just stating facts the way she did when she was taking charge. "Carlos, help your mother to the car. I'll drive." The ride to the hospital was a blur of streetlights and shallow breathing. I sat in the back seat while Carlos held my hand, and Lucia navigated through traffic with calm precision. She spoke in her efficient voice to someone on her Bluetooth headset, though I couldn't focus enough to understand who or what she was saying. "We're almost there, Señora Gonzalez," she said, catching my eyes in the rearview mirror. "Everything is going to be fine. St. Mary's has an excellent cardiac unit. Dr. Patterson there treated my uncle last year, and he said they have all the latest equipment." I nodded weakly, grateful for her confidence, for the way she seemed to know exactly what to do. This was why Carlos had fallen in love with her, I thought. Lucia was the kind of woman who made everything better just by being present, who brought order to chaos and calm to crisis. We pulled up to the emergency entrance, and Lucia left the car running while Carlos helped me out. The automatic doors whooshed open, and suddenly we were in the bright, antiseptic world of the hospital emergency room. The smell hit me immediately, that particular combination of disinfectant and fear and hope that every hospital seems to carry in its walls. The waiting room was crowded even though it was nearly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. A young mother held a feverish toddler while an older man sat hunched over with his arm in a makeshift sling. 2 teenage boys with what looked like sports injuries occupied chairs near the television, and in the corner, an elderly woman much like myself sat alone, staring at her hands. Lucia approached the registration desk with my insurance cards and identification while Carlos helped me into a wheelchair that a nurse had brought over. The registration clerk, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, began typing information into her computer. "What seems to be the problem tonight, honey?" she asked me directly. And I tried to explain about the chest pain, about the difficulty breathing, about how it had started so suddenly during my prayers. "Any family history of heart disease?" she continued, and I nodded, thinking of my mother, who had died of a heart attack at 68, of my brother who had bypass surgery at 55. "We'll get you checked in and seen as soon as possible," the clerk assured me. "It's been a busy night, but chest pain gets priority. You'll probably wait about an hour, maybe 2. Lucia returned with a clipboard full of forms, and she sat down beside me to help fill them out. Her handwriting was neat and precise as she transferred information from my insurance cards, asked me about medications and allergies, made sure every blank was properly completed. "There," she said, handing the clipboard back to the desk clerk. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everything should be in order. Carlos had parked the car and returned, and for a few minutes, we sat together in that liminal space that emergency rooms create, where time moves differently and everyone is suspended between their normal life and whatever crisis has brought them here. That's when Lucia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," she said, standing and walking a few steps away for privacy. I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about a client, meeting that had been moved up, about preparations that needed to be completed tonight, about how she couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. Her voice carried the tension of someone juggling too many responsibilities, and I felt a pang of guilt for adding to her burden. When she returned, her expression was troubled. "Carlos," she said quietly, "that was Morrison Industries. They moved up our presentation to 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I still have 3 hours of preparation work to do tonight. Carlos looked torn, glancing between his wife and me. Can't you do it tomorrow early? The client is flying in from Denver specifically for this meeting. If we're not ready, we lose a $250,000 contract. Lucia's voice was strained, and I could see the conflict playing out across her face. But I don't want to leave. Your mother. Go, I said softly, reaching out to touch her arm. Mija, you've done so much already. Carlos can stay with me. But Carlos was shaking his head. I can't drive, Mommy. Remember? My license was suspended after that accident last month. I was going to tell you, but I didn't want you to worry. Of course. I had forgotten about Carlos's troubles with the insurance company, about how he had been taking the bus to work for the past 3 weeks. My mind felt foggy from the pain and the stress, and details that should have been obvious were slipping away from me. Look, Lucia said, and her voice took on that efficient problem-solving tone that I had come to associate with her professional life. The registration clerk said it would be at least an hour before you're seen, probably 2. I can drop Carlos off at home to get his preparation work done, then come back for you. By the time I return, you'll probably just be getting called back to see the doctor. It made sense logically. Lucia was always logical, always practical. And I didn't want to be the reason she lost such an important contract. Didn't want my medical emergency to derail her career advancement. Are you sure you'll be okay alone, Mommy? Carlos asked, and I could hear the worry in his voice, but also the relief. He had been under so much stress lately with work and the license situation, and I knew he was counting on Lucia's success to help stabilize their financial situation. I'll be fine, mijo. There are nurses here, doctors, other people. Nothing bad can happen in a hospital, right? I tried to smile, tried to project more strength than I felt. Lucia was already gathering her purse, checking her phone again. I'll be back in 2 hours, 3 at the most. If they call you back before then, just tell them your daughter-in-law is coming right back, that there was just a family emergency that needed attention. She leaned down and kissed my forehead, and her lips felt cool against my skin. You're going to be fine, Señora Gonzalez. I can feel it. You're stronger than you know. Carlos hugged me carefully, avoiding putting pressure on my chest. I love you, Mommy. Lucia will be back soon, and everything will be fine. And then they were gone, and I was alone. The waiting room chair was uncomfortable, one of those institutional pieces of furniture designed more for easy cleaning than human comfort. The vinyl covering was cracked in places, and every time I shifted position, it made small squeaking sounds that seemed too loud in the relative quiet of the evening. I watched the other patients around me, noting how some had family members who stayed close, holding hands, offering quiet words of comfort. The young mother with the sick toddler had her husband arrive about 20 minutes after Carlos and Lucia left, and I watched him take the child so she could rest her arms. The elderly woman in the corner was eventually joined by what looked like her adult daughter, who brought a thermos of coffee and a warm blanket from home. The first hour passed slowly. I tried to read a magazine from the waiting room table, but the words seemed to swim on the page, and the chest pain made it difficult to concentrate. A few times, I considered approaching the desk to ask how much longer the wait might be, but I didn't want to be one of those difficult patients that the staff would remember with annoyance. During the second hour, the pain began to intensify again. What had been a tight, pressing sensation became sharper, more immediate. I found myself breathing in small, careful sips of air, afraid that deeper breaths would trigger something worse. A new shift of nurses arrived, and I watched them chat quietly at the desk, reviewing charts and patient lists. One of them, a Hispanic woman about my daughter's age, caught my eye and smiled sympathetically. "How are you feeling, Señora?" she asked, stopping by my chair. "The pain is getting worse," I admitted, and she frowned with concern. Let me check with the doctor about your status, she said, walking back to the desk and typing something into the computer. She returned. A few minutes later with a blood pressure cuff and a small electronic device that she clipped to my finger. Your vitals look stable, which is good news, she said after recording the numbers on a small notepad. Dr. Reeves will see you next, probably within the hour. Is your family coming back soon? My daughter-in-law should be here any time now, I said, glancing at the clock and realizing that 3 hours had already passed. Where was Lucia? The third hour was the hardest. The waiting room had quieted as the evening wore on, and several of the patients who had been there when I arrived had been called back or had left. New people arrived with their own emergencies, but they seemed to move through the system faster than I was, and I began to wonder if I had been forgotten somehow. I tried calling Carlos's house, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried Lucia's cell phone, but it rang several times and then went to voicemail as well. Maybe they were both so focused on their work that they had turned off their phones. Or maybe they were already on their way back to the hospital. But as the fourth hour began, I realized that something was wrong. Even if Lucia's work had taken longer than expected, even if she had gotten caught up in preparation for her meeting, she would have called. She would have let me know what was happening. The sharp pain in my chest was joined now by a different kind of pain, a hollowness that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with the growing realization that I had been abandoned. During the fifth hour, I watched a man about Carlos's age arrive with what looked like a broken wrist. He was seen and treated and released before I was even called back for initial screening. I began to wonder if there had been some mistake with my paperwork, if somehow I had fallen through the cracks of the hospital system. The sixth hour brought a new kind of desperation. The chest pain was constant now, a grinding presence that made every breath an effort. But worse than the physical discomfort was the emotional pain of understanding that my daughter-in-law was not coming back. That whatever business emergency had taken her away was more important than my medical emergency. I tried to be rational about it. Lucia was building her career, trying to establish herself in a competitive field. A $250,000 contract was a significant opportunity, something that could change their whole financial future. Maybe she had gotten caught up in negotiations that ran late into the night. Maybe she had tried to call, but couldn't get through. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for why she hadn't returned. But as the seventh hour passed, and then the eighth, I had to face the truth that I had been trying to avoid. I had been abandoned, left alone in my moment of greatest vulnerability by the woman who had promised to love my family as her own. The ninth hour brought a different kind of nurse, one who seemed more senior, more authoritative. She approached my chair with a chart in her hand and a frown of concern on her face. Mrs. Gonzalez, I'm Sharon, the charge nurse. I see you've been waiting quite a while. Let me check on your status and see what's causing the delay. She disappeared behind the desk for several minutes, and I could see her having animated conversations with other staff members, pointing at computer screens and making notes on papers. When she returned, her expression was apologetic. I'm so sorry for the long wait. There was a multi-vehicle accident earlier that brought in several critical patients, and it backed up our entire schedule, but Dr. Reeves is ready to see you now. Finally, after more than 9 hours, I was being called back. But as I stood up from that uncomfortable chair, as the nurse helped steady me because my legs had grown stiff from sitting so long, I realized that the physical relief of finally being seen was overshadowed by the emotional devastation of understanding how completely I had been forgotten. The 10th hour was spent in an examination room, answering questions about my medical history, having blood drawn, getting an EKG that showed irregular rhythms that concerned the doctor enough to order additional tests. I'd like to keep you overnight for observation, Dr. Reeves said, a young man with kind eyes and gentle hands who reminded me of Carlos at that age. The EKG shows some abnormalities that could indicate the beginning of a cardiac event, and your blood work shows Elevated enzymes that we need to monitor. Should I call my family? I asked. And even as I said it, I felt the bitter irony of the question. Yes, definitely. You'll want someone to know where you are, and they might want to bring you some personal items for your stay. I tried Carlos's phone again, and this time he answered on the third ring. But his voice was thick with sleep, confused and disoriented. Mommy? What time is it? Is everything okay? Carlos, I'm still at the hospital. They want to keep me overnight for observation. There was a long pause, and I could hear him becoming more alert, more aware. Still at the hospital. But Lucia said she was going back to get you hours ago. She left here around midnight. Midnight. It was now nearly 6 in the morning. I had been at the hospital for 9 hours, and Lucia had left their house 6 hours ago, supposedly to come back for me. She never came back, mijo. Another long pause, and I could hear the confusion and growing concern in Carlos's voice. That doesn't make sense. She said she was going straight to the hospital after she finished her presentation prep. Let me call her phone. But even as he said it, I knew what he would find. The same voicemail message that I had been hearing all night. The same silence that had surrounded me for all those hours in that waiting room chair. The 11th hour was spent being admitted to a hospital room, changing into a hospital gown that was too thin and too short, trying to get comfortable in a bed that was too narrow and too high. The nurse who helped me get settled was efficient and kind, but she kept asking about my family, about whether anyone was coming to be with me. My son is coming, I said, because I knew Carlos would come as soon as he could figure out transportation. And my daughter-in-law. But I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't put into words the betrayal that was still so fresh, so unbelievable. The 12th hour brought Carlos, who arrived looking frantic and disheveled, still in his pajamas, under a hastily thrown-on jacket. He had taken 2 buses and walked 4 blocks to get to the hospital, and his face was flushed with exertion and worry. Mommy, I'm so sorry, he said, taking my hand and squeezing it tight. I can't believe you were alone all night. I can't believe. Lucia never came back. Where is she? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Carlos's face darkened with an expression I had never seen before, a combination of anger and hurt and confusion that made my heart ache for different reasons than the medical ones that had brought me here. I don't know, he said quietly. She never came home last night. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her office said she called in sick today, but she's not at home, she's not answering her phone, and her car isn't in the driveway. The implications of his words settled over me like a cold blanket. Lucia hadn't just abandoned me at the hospital. She had disappeared entirely, vanishing from all the normal places and routines of her life, leaving behind questions that had no easy answers. As I lay in that hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor that would track my recovery over the next 2 days, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I tried to understand how the woman who had seemed so caring, so responsible, so committed to our family, could have simply walked away when I needed her most. But understanding would have to wait. Recovery would have to come first. And then, when I was stronger, when I was ready, I would have to confront the truth about my daughter-in-law, about the woman my son had married, about the person I had trusted with my family's love and my own vulnerable heart. I had no idea then that this abandonment was just the beginning, that the real test of character was still to come, and that the truth about Lucia would prove to be far more complicated and far more devastating than anything I could have imagined during those 12 hours alone in that emergency room waiting room. The heart monitor continued its steady beeping, marking time, marking the rhythm of a heart that was physically healing, but emotionally shattered, preparing for revelations that would change everything I thought I knew about family, about trust, and about the price of love when it's offered to someone who doesn't understand its true value. Recovery came slowly, like dawn breaking through thick clouds. The doctors kept me in the hospital for 3 days, monitoring my heart rhythms, adjusting medications, running tests that had names I couldn't pronounce but results that gradually improved. Carlos stayed by my side as much as his work schedule allowed, bringing me books I was too distracted to read, and flowers that brightened the sterile room but couldn't lift the weight that had settled in my chest alongside the cardiac pain. Lucia remained absent, a ghost who had vanished from our lives as completely as if she had never existed. Her disappearance became the unspoken presence in every conversation Carlos and I had, the elephant in the room that grew larger with each passing hour of silence from her phone, each day that her car remained missing from their driveway, each night that Carlos came home to an empty house and unanswered questions. On the second day, while I was dozing fitfully between visits from various medical professionals, I overheard Carlos talking quietly on his phone in the hallway outside my room. His voice carried the particular strain of someone trying to maintain composure while his world crumbled around him. "No, she didn't come home last night either," he was saying to someone, probably his older sister Elena, who lived 3 states away. The hospital called her work, and they said she took emergency leave, but nobody knows where she went. Her sister hasn't heard from her. Her parents don't know anything. And her best friend Maria Teresa says the last time they talked was 2 weeks ago. I heard him pause, listening to Elena's response, and then his voice became even quieter, more pained. "I keep thinking there has to be an explanation, you know? People don't just disappear, especially not Lucia. She's so organized, so responsible. She has color-coded calendars, for God's sake. She doesn't just vanish without telling anyone where she's going." But the truth was beginning to settle into all of us, even if Carlos wasn't ready to accept it yet. People do disappear, especially when they're running from something or toward something that requires leaving their old life behind. The question that haunted me during those long hospital nights was what Lucia had been running from, or what had been important enough to make her abandon not just me in that emergency room, but her entire marriage, her career, her carefully constructed life. When I was finally discharged, Carlos drove me home in a borrowed car from his coworker, and the familiar streets of our neighborhood looked different somehow, as if the events of the past few days had shifted everything slightly out of alignment. My small house, which had always been my sanctuary, felt larger and emptier than usual, full of shadows and silence that seemed to echo with questions I couldn't answer. Carlos helped me get settled, fussing over my medications and making sure I had everything I needed within easy reach. He had taken time off work to stay with me for the first few days, sleeping on my couch and jumping up at every small sound to make sure I was all right. His devotion was touching, but I could see the toll that Lucia's disappearance was taking on him. He looked older, more fragile, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, while Carlos was napping on the couch and I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, that I began to really think about Lucia for the first time since the hospital. Not about her absence, which had dominated my thoughts for days, but about her presence in our lives over the past 4 years of her marriage to Carlos. I had always prided myself on being a good judge of character. Raising 3 children alone had required developing sharp instincts about people, learning to read between the lines of what people said and did, understanding the difference between genuine care and surface politeness. But as I sat there in the afternoon sunlight, reviewing my memories of Lucia, I began to wonder if my instincts had failed me completely. When Carlos first brought her home to meet the family, about 6 months before they got married, she had seemed perfect, not just beautiful, though she certainly was that, with her glossy dark hair and expressive eyes and the kind of effortless elegance that made even casual clothes look sophisticated. But more than her appearance, it was her manner that had impressed me. She was respectful without being subservient, confident without being arrogant, interested in our family stories and traditions without seeming to be performing some kind of cultural appreciation theater. She had arrived that first Sunday afternoon carrying homemade flan that she claimed was made from her grandmother's recipe, and she had insisted on helping me in the kitchen while the men watched football, rolling up her sleeves and washing dishes, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who was genuinely comfortable with domestic work. We had talked about cooking and family and her job in marketing, and she had asked thoughtful questions about my late husband and my experiences as a single mother. "I admire you so much, Señora Gonzalez," she had said while drying a pot with careful attention to detail. Raising 3 children alone, working multiple jobs, making sure they all got good educations and stayed out of trouble. That takes incredible strength. Her words had felt genuine, not like the empty flattery that some people offer when they're trying to ingratiate themselves. She had seemed truly interested in my stories about the early years after Roberto's death, about the challenges of balancing work and parenting, about the small victories and daily struggles that had shaped our family's history. Over the months that followed, as her relationship with Carlos deepened and became more serious, Lucia had continued to be a model daughter-in-law-to-be. She never missed a family gathering, never forgot a birthday or holiday, never seemed impatient with our traditions or customs that might have seemed old-fashioned to someone of her generation and educational background. When Carlos proposed, she had cried with what appeared to be genuine joy, and she had insisted on a traditional Catholic ceremony, despite having been raised in a more progressive household where religion was respected but not central. She had spent hours with me learning family recipes, asking about Roberto's favorite meals and our holiday customs, seeming to genuinely want to become part of our family's continuing story, rather than simply marrying into it. The wedding had been beautiful, a celebration that honored both families' traditions while reflecting Carlos and Lucia's personalities and values. She had worn my grandmother's rosary and Roberto's mother's wedding ring, incorporating pieces of our family history into her bridal ensemble with what seemed like genuine reverence. During the reception, she had made sure to spend time with every elderly relative, dancing with Carlos's great-uncle Manuel, who was 92 and could barely walk, listening patiently to his stories about the old country that everyone else had heard dozens of times. In the early months of their marriage, Lucia had been everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She called regularly to check on me, remembered my doctor's appointments, and followed up to ask about the results, invited me to dinner at least twice a month, and always made sure to prepare foods that accommodated my dietary restrictions. When I had a minor fall in my garden and sprained my ankle, she had shown up at my house with groceries and offers to help with cleaning, refusing to let me pay her back and insisting that family doesn't keep score of such things. But now, sitting in my chair and really examining those memories with the harsh clarity that comes after betrayal, I began to notice details that I had overlooked or dismissed at the time. Small things, inconsistencies that had seemed unimportant when I was focused on how much Carlos loved her and how happy she seemed to make him. There had been phone calls that she would step outside to take, claiming they were work-related but lasting much longer than typical business conversations. There had been unexplained absences from family gatherings, emergencies at work that seemed to occur with suspicious frequency whenever we had planned something special. There had been comments about money that had struck me as slightly odd at the time, but that I had rationalized away. I remembered one particular conversation from about 6 months after the wedding, when Lucia and I had been alone in my kitchen while Carlos was outside fixing a problem with my back porch steps. She had been asking about the neighborhood, about property values, and whether I had ever considered selling the house. "This area is really developing," she had said, running her hand along my kitchen counter with what seemed like casual interest. I saw that the Morales house down the street sold for almost twice what they paid for it 10 years ago. "Have you ever had your house appraised?" At the time, I had assumed she was making conversation, perhaps thinking about the future value of her and Carlos's investment in their own home. But now I wondered if there had been more calculation behind her questions than I had realized. There had been other moments, too. Times when she had steered conversations toward my late husband's life insurance policy, about the small pension I received from the textile factory, about whether I had made arrangements for my affairs in case something happened to me. Again, these had seemed like the natural concerns of a caring daughter-in-law who wanted to make sure her husband's mother was properly protected and prepared. But in the light of her abandonment at the hospital, they took on a different cast, entirely. The more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that Lucia's interest in our family had always seemed to focus on certain areas more than others. She was fascinated by stories about Roberto's construction business and how well it had done in its final years before his death. She asked detailed questions about the house he had built for us, about the improvements he had made, about the neighborhood's development over the decades we had lived there. She was less interested in other aspects of our family history. She never asked about Roberto's struggles with alcohol after he came back from Vietnam, about the years when his construction business barely kept us afloat, about the times when I had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. She seemed to prefer the sanitized version of our story, the one that emphasized success and accumulation rather than struggle and sacrifice. Carlos stirred on the couch, and I realized I had been sitting in silence for over an hour, lost in these uncomfortable recollections. He sat up slowly, looking disoriented and vulnerable in the way that people do when they wake up in an unfamiliar place, forgetting for a moment where they are and why. "How are you feeling, Mommy?" he asked, automatically reaching for the glass of water that he kept on the coffee table for me, a habit he had developed during my recovery. "I'm fine, mijo," I said, though fine was far from accurate. "How are you doing?" It was a loaded question, and we both knew it. Carlos had been avoiding talking about Lucia's disappearance except in the most practical terms, focusing on the logistical challenges of her absence rather than the emotional devastation of her abandonment. But I could see in his eyes that he was struggling with the same kinds of questions that had been occupying my thoughts. "I don't understand it," he said finally, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded me painfully of Roberto at moments of stress. "I keep going over everything in my mind, trying to figure out what I missed, what signs I should have seen. But I can't find anything, Mommy." She seemed happy. We seemed happy. I wanted to comfort him, to offer some explanation that would make sense of Lucia's behavior. But I was beginning to suspect that the truth might be more complicated and more painful than either of us was prepared to face. "People are complicated, Carlos," I said carefully. "Sometimes they keep parts of themselves hidden, even from the people they love most." "But we were married for 4 years," he said, and his voice carried the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been shattered. "We shared everything. We talked about having children, about buying a bigger house, about growing old together. How do you fake that kind of intimacy?" It was a question I couldn't answer, but it made me think about another aspect of Lucia's behavior that had puzzled me at the time. Despite all her talk about wanting to be part of our family, despite her apparent eagerness to learn our traditions and participate in our celebrations, she had never seemed to develop genuine friendships with other family members beyond the basic social requirements. My daughter Elena, who was usually very good at connecting with new people, had mentioned several times that she found Lucia difficult to get to know. "She's perfectly pleasant," Elena had said after one family gathering. "But I feel like I'm talking to a very polite stranger. I never feel like I'm seeing the real person underneath all that courtesy." My oldest son Miguel had been even more direct. "There's something about her that doesn't quite add up," he had told me privately after Carlos and Lucia's second anniversary dinner. "She says all the right things, does all the right things, but it feels rehearsed somehow, like she's playing a role rather than just being herself." At the time, I had dismissed their concerns as the natural wariness that families sometimes feel toward new members, the difficulty of adjusting to someone who hadn't been part of our shared history, and inside jokes and unspoken understandings. But now I wondered if they had been picking up on something that I had been too hopeful, too grateful for Carlos's happiness to notice. The phone rang, interrupting my brooding, and Carlos jumped to answer it with the desperate eagerness of someone hoping for news that might explain the unexplainable. "Hello," he said, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice when he realized it wasn't Lucia. "Oh, hi, Detective Morrison." Detective Morrison was the police officer who had taken the missing person report when Carlos finally accepted that Lucia's disappearance wasn't just a temporary absence that could be explained by work stress or family emergency. The detective had been kind but realistic about the limitations of what the police could do in cases where adults disappeared voluntarily, especially when there was no evidence of foul play. "I see," Carlos was saying, his voice growing flatter, with each word. "So the credit card was used where? Phoenix? When?" He paused, listening, and I saw his face change as the implications of whatever he was hearing began to sink in. "How much money are we talking about?" My heart began to race again, but this time it had nothing to do with my cardiac condition and everything to do with the growing certainty that Lucia's disappearance was not the impulsive act of a woman overwhelmed by crisis, but something much more calculated and deliberate. Carlos hung up the phone and sat down heavily, staring at his hands as if they might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask out loud. "What did the detective say?" I asked gently. "Lucia used our joint credit card yesterday in Phoenix," he said without looking up. "She withdrew the maximum daily cash advance, $1,500, and she bought a plane ticket. The detective thinks she's probably left the state, maybe left the country." The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. Lucia hadn't disappeared in a moment of panic or confusion. She had planned this, had access to money, had made deliberate choices about where to go and how to disappear. The woman who had abandoned me in that emergency room had been thinking clearly enough to cover her tracks and fund her escape. "There's more," Carlos continued, and his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "The detective ran a background check, something he probably should have suggested when I first filed the report. Lucia's maiden name, her social security number, her employment history, none of it checks out completely." I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law was crumbling beneath me. "What do you mean it doesn't check out?" "I mean the woman I married, the woman who lived in my house for 4 years, the woman who sat at your kitchen table and called you mommy. She's not exactly who she claimed to be." The implications of his words hung in the air between us like smoke, obscuring everything I thought I understood about the past 4 years. About the woman who had seemed so perfect for my son. About the family bonds I had believed were growing, stronger with each shared meal and celebration. Carlos was still staring at his hands, and I realized he was crying, tears falling silently onto his palms as the full scope of Lucia's deception began to reveal itself. I wanted to go to him, to hold him the way I had when he was a child, and the world had disappointed him, but I felt frozen in my chair, paralyzed by the magnitude of what we were learning. "The detective wants to meet with us tomorrow," Carlos said eventually. "He has more information, but he wanted to tell us in person. He said it's complicated, that there might be other people involved, other families who've been affected by similar situations. Other families." The phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to process what it might mean. Had Lucia done this before? Had there been other sons, other mothers-in-law, other families who had opened their hearts and lives to a woman who was systematically deceiving them? As the afternoon wore on and Carlos made phone calls to his siblings to explain what little we knew, I found myself returning obsessively to my memories of Lucia, searching for clues I had missed, signs I should have recognized, moments when her mask might have slipped enough to reveal her true intentions. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Lucia had been extraordinarily skilled at her deception. She had never asked directly about money or property. She had never pushed too hard for information about my financial situation or Roberto's estate. Instead, she had been patient, building trust slowly, establishing herself as a reliable and caring family member, before gradually steering conversations toward topics that would give her the information she needed. She had been playing a long game, I realized. Not the impulsive crime of opportunity that I might have expected from someone desperate enough to abandon an elderly woman in a hospital, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of emotional manipulation, designed to achieve goals that I was only beginning to understand. The sun was setting outside my window, casting long shadows across my living room, and I realized that this day had marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Yesterday, I had been a woman recovering from a medical emergency, grateful to be alive and focused on healing. Today, I was a woman coming to terms with the fact that I had been systematically deceived by someone I had trusted completely, someone I had welcomed into my family and my heart. But even as I absorbed the shock of these revelations, even as I watched my son struggle with the collapse of his marriage and the destruction of his faith in the woman he had loved, I felt something else stirring in my chest, alongside the fear and confusion and grief. I felt anger. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, patient anger of someone who has been underestimated, someone who has been seen as an easy target by a person who made the mistake of confusing age and kindness with weakness and naivety. Lucia had made a fundamental error in her calculations about the Gonzalez family. She had seen an elderly widow and assumed vulnerability. She had seen a loving son and assumed gullibility. She had seen a close-knit family and assumed they would be easy to manipulate through their affection for each other. But what she had failed to understand was that families like ours, families forged by hardship and held together by necessity, develop a strength that goes beyond sentiment. We had survived Roberto's death, Carlos's struggles, Elena's divorce, Miguel's unemployment, and dozens of other crises that would have destroyed weaker bonds. We had learned to protect each other, to see through deception, to fight for what mattered most. And now, whether she realized it or not, Lucia had declared war on my family. She had used our love against us, exploited our trust, abandoned me when I was most vulnerable, and broken my son's heart in the process. As I sat in my chair watching the last light fade from the sky, I made a decision that would have surprised the woman who had left me alone in that emergency room. I decided that this story was far from over, that Lucia might have had the first move, might have executed her deception with skill and patience, but she had made the mistake of assuming that her victims would remain passive, that we would simply accept our losses and move on with our lives. She was about to learn how wrong she had been about the Gonzalez family and about the woman she had so casually abandoned when she thought I was no longer useful to her plans. The phone rang again, and this time it was Elena calling from Oregon, her voice tight with worry and barely controlled fury when Carlos explained what the detective had told us. "I never trusted her," Elena said, and even through the phone, I could hear the satisfaction of vindicated instinct alongside her concern for her brother. There was always something off about her, something too perfect, too rehearsed. But Carlos was so happy, and you seemed to like her so much, that I convinced myself I was being paranoid. "We all saw what we wanted to see," I said, taking the phone from Carlos because I could see that talking about Lucia's deception was almost more than he could bear. She was very good at showing people what they wanted to see. "What are you going to do?" Elena asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood that this situation called for more than just filing police reports and hoping for the best. "We're going to find out the truth," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. All of it. Who she really is, what she really wanted, and whether she's done this to other families. And then? And then we're going to make sure she faces the consequences of what she's done. After I hung up the phone, Carlos looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, a mixture of admiration and slight apprehension that suggested he recognized something in my voice that reminded him of the woman who had raised 3 children alone and had never backed down from a fight when her family was threatened. "Mommy," he said carefully, "what exactly are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that your wife made a very serious mistake when she decided to target this family," I said, and for the first time since waking up in that hospital room, I felt like myself again. "And I'm thinking that it's time for Maria Gonzalez to remind the world what happens when someone tries to take advantage of a woman who has spent 73 years learning how to survive." The heart monitor might have shown that my cardiac rhythms were returning to normal, but my pulse was quickening with something that had nothing to do with medical conditions and everything to do with the realization that the most important battle of my life was just beginning. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I had learned that my daughter-in-law was not who she claimed to be. I was in my kitchen making coffee, enjoying the quiet ritual of measuring grounds and watching the first light filter through my yellow curtains when the phone shattered the peaceful silence with its urgent ringing. I almost didn't answer. These days, most calls brought bad news or complications, and I had been savoring these early morning moments before the weight of our situation settled over me like a familiar but unwelcome shawl. But something about the persistence of the ringing made me reach for the receiver, and I'm grateful now that I did. "Mrs. Gonzalez? This is Detective Morrison. I know it's early, but I have some information that I think you and Carlos need to hear as soon as possible." The detective's voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench with anticipation. In the weeks since Lucia's disappearance, Detective Morrison had become a regular presence in our lives, calling with updates that were usually disappointing, small pieces of information that raised more questions than they answered. "What is it, Detective?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. "We've located Lucia. She's in Las Vegas, and she's been arrested." Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I had to sit down at my kitchen table, gripping the phone with both hands. After weeks of wondering where she was, whether she was safe, whether we would ever get answers to the questions that had been eating away at all of us, we finally had something concrete. "Arrested for what?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "Fraud, identity theft. She was caught trying to open bank accounts using stolen personal information. But Mrs. Gonzalez, there's more. Much more. Can you and Carlos come to the station this morning? I think it would be better if I explained everything in person." Carlos was still asleep on my couch, where he had been spending most nights since Lucia's disappearance. He claimed it was because he wanted to make sure I was recovering properly from my heart episode, but I knew the truth was that he couldn't bear to be alone in the house he had shared with a woman who turned out to be a stranger. I woke him gently, and within an hour we were sitting in Detective Morrison's small, cluttered office at the police station, surrounded by file folders and coffee-stained paperwork that seemed to document the endless stream of human deception and disappointment that crossed his desk. Detective Morrison was a man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much dishonesty to be easily surprised. But as he spread photographs and documents across his desk, I could see that even he was somewhat amazed by the scope of what he was about to tell us. "Your daughter-in-law's real name is Lisa Marie Cortez," he began, sliding a photograph across the desk. It showed Lucia, but somehow different, younger perhaps, or maybe just less polished. Her hair was shorter, her clothing more casual, and there was something in her expression that was harder, more calculating than the warm, caring woman I thought I had known. "She's 34 years old, not 31 as she told you. She was born in Albuquerque, dropped out of high school at 17, and has been arrested 6 times in 4 different states for various forms of fraud and identity theft." Carlos stared at the photograph as if it might transform back into the woman he had married, but I found myself studying it with a different kind of attention. This was the real person who had sat at my kitchen table, who had learned my grandmother's recipes, who had held my hand during family prayers. This was the woman who had abandoned me in that emergency room. "She's what we call a long-term con artist," Detective Morrison continued. She targets middle-class families, usually through romantic relationships with the adult children. She spends months, sometimes years, building trust and gathering information about the family's financial situation before making her move. He opened another file folder and pulled out a stack of papers that made my heart sink with their thickness. We've identified at least 7 other families in 5 states who were victimized by Lisa over the past 12 years. The pattern is always the same. She assumes a new identity, meets a man through work or social activities, develops a relationship, gets married or moves in with him, and then systematically gathers information about the family's assets. "What kind of information?" Carlos asked, and his voice sounded hollow, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Property deeds, bank account numbers, social security numbers, insurance policies, investment portfolios." She's particularly interested in elderly family members who might be vulnerable to financial manipulation or who might be convinced to change their wills or add her to their accounts. The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about all the conversations Lucia and I had shared, all the times she had asked seemingly innocent questions about my late husband's business, about my house, about my plans for the future. I had interpreted her interest as the natural concern of a caring daughter-in-law, but now I understood that every question had been a probe, every conversation a fishing expedition. "How does she usually get the money?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Detective Morrison's expression grew even more grim. "Various methods. Sometimes she convinces elderly family members to add her to their bank accounts or to sign documents that give her power of attorney. Sometimes she files fraudulent insurance claims or applies for credit cards using stolen information. In at least 3 cases, she convinced elderly relatives to take out large loans or reverse mortgages, promising to help them manage the money. But I never gave her access to any of my accounts," I said, feeling confused and somewhat relieved. "I never signed anything or gave her any financial information." "That's what makes your case unusual," Detective Morrison said, opening yet another file. "With the other families, she usually stayed until she had extracted significant amounts of money. But she left you abruptly, without completing whatever plan she had in mind." "So why did she disappear?" Carlos asked. "If she hadn't gotten what she wanted yet, why run?" Detective Morrison looked uncomfortable, shifting papers around on his desk before answering. "We think something spooked her. Maybe she realized that you were becoming suspicious, or maybe there was some external pressure that forced her to accelerate her timeline." But as he spoke, I was remembering that night in the emergency room, the way Lucia had seemed so eager to leave, so quick to find excuses to avoid staying with me. At the time, I had attributed her behavior to work stress and the pressure of her important meeting, but now I wondered if there had been something else driving her urgency. "There's something else," Detective Morrison said, and the reluctance in his voice made me brace myself for yet another revelation. When Lisa was arrested in Las Vegas, she had a significant amount of cash with her, $15,000. She also had multiple credit cards, driver's licenses, and social security cards in different names. He paused, looking directly at me with an expression of professional sympathy that I had learned to recognize in doctors and social workers and other people whose jobs required them to deliver difficult news to families in crisis. One of the identities she was using belonged to a woman named Maria Santos, an elderly widow from Phoenix who died 6 months ago. "The resemblance to your situation is striking enough that we think Lisa might have been planning to assume your identity after something happened to you." The room went very quiet. I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant sound of phones ringing in other offices, the shuffle of papers being moved around on nearby desks. But in our small circle around Detective Morrison's desk, there was only the terrible silence of understanding what he was implying. "You think she was planning to kill my mother?" Carlos asked, and his voice cracked on the last word. "We don't have any direct evidence of that," Detective Morrison said quickly. But the pattern suggests that she was positioning herself to benefit from your mother's death, whether that death was natural or accelerated. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the full scope of Lucia's intentions became clear. The woman who had learned my recipes and called me mommy had been studying me not out of love or even simple greed, but as a predator studies prey, learning my habits and vulnerabilities so that she could eventually take my place. The emergency room, I said suddenly, as pieces of a horrible puzzle began to click into place. She left me there on purpose. She was hoping something would happen to me. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. It's possible. Elderly people die in hospitals all the time, especially people with heart conditions who don't receive immediate care. If you had died that night, Lisa would have been the grieving daughter-in-law, the devoted wife who had tried so hard to get you the help you needed, but arrived just too late. Carlos made a sound that was part sob, part growl of rage. She married me to get to my mother. 4 years of my life. 4 years of thinking I had found someone who loved me. And it was all just a setup to murder my mother and steal her identity. We can't prove the murder part, Detective Morrison cautioned. But the identity theft was definitely part of her plan. She had already started the process of gathering the documents she would need to assume your mother's identity, including copies of her birth certificate, social security card, and medical records. How did she get my medical records? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. She had access to your personal information through Carlos. Insurance, cards, emergency contact forms, medical power of attorney documents that married couples often share. She photographed everything and was already in the process of building a false identity based on your personal information. The violation felt almost as profound as the abandonment. Not only had Lucia planned to steal my life, she had been systematically stealing pieces of my identity for months, maybe years, preparing for the day when she would step into my shoes and continue living my life with my money and my possessions and my family's love. What happens now? I asked. To her, I mean. What are the charges? Multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, credit card fraud, and conspiracy. With her history, she's looking at serious prison time, probably 10 to 15 years if she's convicted on all counts. And the other families? The other people she hurt? We're working with law enforcement in multiple states to build cases. Some of the families lost their life savings, their homes, their retirement funds. One elderly man in Colorado died of a heart attack after discovering that Lisa had emptied his account and disappeared. His family is pursuing wrongful death charges. I thought about that unknown man in Colorado, about his family's grief and rage and the terrible realization that someone they had trusted had contributed to his death. I thought about all the other families who had welcomed Lisa into their lives, who had loved her and trusted her and suffered because of their generosity. I want to testify, I said suddenly. When her case goes to trial, I want to tell the court what she did to us. Detective Morrison smiled for the first time since we had arrived. I was hoping you'd say that. Your testimony could be crucial in establishing the pattern of her behavior, showing that the abandonment at the hospital was part of a larger plan rather than just a moment of panic. When will the trial be? Carlos asked. Probably not for several months. These kinds of cases take time to build, especially when they involve multiple jurisdictions and multiple victims. But Mrs. Gonzalez, there is one more thing I need to tell you. I braced myself for yet another revelation, another piece of the puzzle that would make Lucia's betrayal even more complete. Lisa wants to see you. What? She's being held in Clark County Jail in Las Vegas, awaiting extradition back to Arizona for the charges related to your case. Her lawyer contacted us yesterday. She says she wants to apologize, that she has information that might help with the investigation, but she'll only talk to you. The idea of seeing Lucia again, of sitting across from the woman who had planned to steal my identity and possibly my life, filled me with a complex mixture of emotions. Fear, certainly, but also anger and curiosity and something else that I couldn't quite identify. "Why would she want to see me?" I asked. "We don't know. It could be genuine remorse, or it could be another manipulation. People like Lisa are skilled at reading situations and adapting their strategies accordingly. She might think that expressing remorse will help her case, or she might be hoping to convince you not to testify against her." Would I have to go to Las Vegas? Not necessarily. We could arrange a video conference call, or we could wait until she's extradited back to Arizona. But her lawyer was specific that she wants to speak with you directly, not through intermediaries. I looked at Carlos, who was staring at me with an expression of horror and disbelief. "Mommy, you can't be considering this. After everything she's done, after what we just learned about her plans, you can't seriously be thinking about talking to her." But the truth was, I was considering it. Not because I had any desire to forgive Lucia, or because I believed her expressions of remorse would be genuine, but because I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how someone could live such an elaborate lie for so long, how she could look me in the eye and call me mommy while planning to take my place. "I need to think about it," I said finally. Detective Morrison nodded. "Take all the time you need, but if you do decide to meet with her, we'll make sure you're protected. The conversation would be recorded, and there would be law enforcement present at all times." As we left the police station and walked to Carlos's borrowed car, I felt a strange sense of anticlimax. After weeks of wondering and worrying and searching for answers, we finally knew the truth about Lucia. But knowing the truth didn't erase the pain of betrayal or restore the trust that had been shattered. If anything, understanding the full scope of her deception made the violation feel even more complete. "Are you really thinking about meeting with her?" Carlos asked as we drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to hear what she has to say, wants to understand how someone can do what she did. But another part of me thinks that seeing her again would just give her another opportunity to manipulate us. She doesn't deserve your forgiveness. Mommy, she doesn't deserve anything from us except our testimony at her trial." "I'm not talking about forgiveness," I said. "I'm talking about understanding. For 4 years, that woman lived in our family, participated in our celebrations, learned our traditions, made herself part of our history. I want to know if any of it was real, if there was ever a moment when she genuinely cared about us, or if it was all calculation from the very beginning." Carlos was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft with the kind of pain that comes from having your fundamental beliefs about human nature challenged. "Does it matter? Whether some of it was real or not, the result is the same. She betrayed us, abandoned you when you needed help most, and was planning to steal your identity, maybe even planning to kill you. Does it matter if she had moments of genuine feeling mixed in with all the deception?" It was a fair question, and I couldn't give him a definitive answer. But as we pulled into my driveway and I looked at the small house that Roberto had built for us so many years ago, the house that Lucia had been studying and evaluating and planning to claim as her own, I realized that it did matter to me. Not because understanding her motivations would excuse her actions or make the betrayal less painful, but because I needed to know, for my own peace of mind, whether the woman who had called me mommy had ever meant it, even for a moment. That evening, as I sat in my kitchen drinking tea and watching the sun set over the neighborhood where I had lived for more than 30 years, my phone rang again. This time it was Elena calling from Oregon, her voice tight with barely controlled rage when I told her what Detective Morrison had revealed. "She was planning to kill you?" Elena's voice rose to a near shout. "That woman was planning to murder my mother and steal her identity?" "We don't know that for certain," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I felt their inadequacy. The evidence might not be legally conclusive, but the pattern was clear enough. "I don't care what we can prove in court," Elena said. "I know what she was planning, and I know that if you had died in that emergency room, she would have been right there to play the grieving daughter-in-law while she figured out how to access your accounts and sell your house." Elena's anger was fierce and protective, and it reminded me of the woman I had been when my children were young, when I would have fought anyone or anything that threatened their safety or well-being. But now I was the one being protected, the one being defended, and it was a strange reversal that made me feel both grateful and oddly diminished. "Detective Morrison said she wants to meet with me," I told Elena, "to apologize and provide information about the case." The silence that followed was so long that I thought the call might have been disconnected. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled in the way that meant she was trying very hard not to say something she might regret. "Please tell me you're not considering it." "I'm thinking about it." "Mommy? No, absolutely not. That woman is dangerous. She's manipulative. And she's already proven that she's willing to put your life at risk to achieve her goals. Meeting with her would be like walking into a trap. There would be police there, and the conversation would be recorded. She couldn't hurt me. She couldn't hurt you physically, maybe, but she could hurt you emotionally, psychologically. She could use the meeting to plant doubts in your mind, to make you question your own perceptions, to manipulate you into feeling sorry for her or into not testifying at her trial." Elena's concerns echoed my own doubts, but they also strengthened my resolve to understand what had happened to our family. "I've been manipulated by her for 4 years," I said. "I think I can handle one conversation where I know what she really is. But why risk it? What could she possibly say that would be worth the emotional cost of seeing her again?" It was the same question Carlos had asked, and I still didn't have a good answer. But as I sat in my kitchen that evening, surrounded by the familiar objects and memories that Lucia had been planning to claim for herself, I felt a growing certainty that I needed to face her one more time. Not to forgive her or to give her an opportunity to manipulate me again, but to reclaim some sense of control over a situation where I had been the victim, the target, the elderly woman who was supposed to be easy prey. The phone rang again later. That evening, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Lucia's voice for the first time since that night in the emergency room, and the sound of it made my hands shake with a complicated mixture of anger and something that might have been grief for the relationship I thought we shared. "Señora Gonzalez, it's me. It's Lucia." She wasn't supposed to be able to call me directly. Detective Morrison had said that any communication would go through official channels, through lawyers and law enforcement. But somehow she had found a way to reach me, and hearing her voice in my kitchen, in the space where we had shared so many conversations, felt like a violation all over again. "How did you get this number?" I asked, though I knew it was a pointless question. A woman who had spent years gathering personal information about my family would certainly have access to my phone number. "I wanted to talk to you before the lawyers and the police made it impossible," she said, and her voice carried a note of urgency that reminded me uncomfortably of the woman I had thought I loved. "I know you hate me now, and you have every right to hate me, but I need you to know that it wasn't supposed to happen the way it did." "What wasn't supposed to happen?" I asked, though part of me wanted to hang up, wanted to refuse to engage with her manipulations again. "The emergency room. Leaving you there." "I never meant for that to happen, Señora Gonzalez. I panicked, and I made a terrible mistake." "You mean you panicked because your plan to let me die in the hospital didn't work out the way you expected?" There was a long pause, and when Lucia spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more like the woman in the police photograph than the daughter-in-law who had learned my recipes. "You don't understand the situation I was in. There were people looking for me, people who would have hurt Carlos and you if they had found me. I had to disappear, and I thought it would be safer for everyone if I left quickly and quietly." So you abandoned a 73-year-old woman with a heart condition in an emergency room because it was safer for everyone? I know how it sounds, but you don't know the whole story. You don't know what I was protecting you from. And there it was, the manipulation that Elena had warned me about, the attempt to reframe her abandonment and betrayal as some kind of sacrifice she had made for my benefit. But instead of feeling confused or uncertain as I might have in the past, I felt a cold clarity that surprised me with its strength. I know enough, I said. I know that you're not who you claim to be. I know that you've done this to other families, that you've stolen money and identities and destroyed lives. I know that you were gathering information about my personal documents and my financial situation, and I know that you left me alone and helpless when I needed you most. I can explain all of that, Lucia said, and her voice took on the pleading tone that I remembered from our family conversations, the tone she used when she wanted something but was trying to seem like she was asking for our benefit rather than her own. I don't want your explanations, I said, and the firmness in my own voice surprised me. I want you to stay away from my family. I want you to accept responsibility for what you've done. And I want you to know that I will testify against you at your trial, and I will make sure that everyone understands exactly what kind of person you really are. Please, Señora Gonzalez, just give me a chance to tell you the truth about what happened. There are things you don't understand, things that might change how you feel about everything. But I was done being manipulated, done being the target of her psychological games. The only truth I need to understand is that you betrayed my family's trust and abandoned me when I was vulnerable. Everything else is just another lie designed to serve your purposes. I hung up the phone before she could respond, and then I sat in my kitchen shaking, not from fear or confusion, but from the adrenaline rush of finally standing up to someone who had victimized me for years without my knowledge. The phone rang again almost immediately, but I let it go to voicemail. And when it rang again after that, I unplugged it from the wall, deciding that Lucia had taken enough of my time and energy and attention. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that something had changed in me during that phone conversation. The woman who had been abandoned in the emergency room, who had spent weeks feeling betrayed and confused and vulnerable, was being replaced by someone stronger. Someone who understood that survival sometimes requires fighting back against people, who see kindness as weakness and trust as opportunity. Tomorrow, I would call Detective Morrison and tell him that I wanted to testify at Lucia's trial. I would make sure that her other victims knew that someone was willing to speak up, willing to put a face and a voice to the damage that people like her inflict on families like ours. And I would make sure that when she was sentenced, the judge understood that her crimes weren't just about money or identity theft, but about the destruction of trust and the violation of the most sacred bonds between people who choose to love each other as family. Lucia had made the mistake of thinking that Maria Gonzalez would be an easy victim, that an elderly widow would be too weak or too isolated to fight back effectively. She was about to learn that some people get stronger, not weaker, when they're pushed to their limits, and that attacking someone's family is the surest way to discover just how fierce a supposedly gentle person can become when everything they love is threatened. The video conference room at the police station felt sterile and artificial, with its gray walls and harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. I sat at a long table facing a large monitor, flanked by Detective Morrison on my left and a prosecutor named Janet Reeves on my right. Carlos had insisted on coming despite my suggestion that he stay home, and he sat behind me with his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. It had been 6 weeks since Lucia's arrest, and I had spent every one of those days preparing for this moment, rehearsing what I would say, imagining how I would feel when I saw her face again. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of watching that familiar figure appear on the screen, sitting in what was clearly a jail conference room, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow and drawn. She looked older than I remembered, Or perhaps it was just that the careful makeup and styling that had always made her appear polished and professional were gone, revealing the harder edges beneath. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and without the softening effects of her usual appearance routine, her features seemed sharper, more calculating. But it was her eyes that struck me most forcefully. The warm, caring expression that I had associated with my daughter-in-law was completely absent, replaced by something that was both desperate and calculating, like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. "Mrs. Gonzalez," she said, and hearing her voice again made my stomach clench with a complicated mixture of emotions. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me." "I'm here to listen to what you have to say," I replied, keeping my voice steady and neutral despite the way my heart was racing. "Detective Morrison said you had information that might help with the investigation." Lucia glanced at someone, off camera, presumably her lawyer, before looking back at me with an expression that was clearly meant to convey remorse and vulnerability. "I want to start by saying how sorry I am for everything that happened. I know that my words can't undo the pain I've caused, but I need you to understand that I never intended for things to go as far as they did." "How far did you intend for them to go?" Prosecutor Reeves asked, her voice crisp and professional. "I was in trouble," Lucia said, and her voice took on the pleading tone that I remembered from our phone conversation. "There were people I owed money to, dangerous people who were threatening to hurt me and anyone close to me if I didn't pay them back. I was desperate, and I made some terrible decisions because I was scared." "What kind of people?" Detective Morrison asked, leaning forward slightly. "Loan sharks, drug dealers. I had gotten involved with some bad people in Phoenix, and they were demanding payment of debts that I couldn't possibly cover with my regular income. They knew about Carlos, about his family, and they made it clear that if I didn't find a way to get the money, they would start targeting the people I cared about." I felt a flash of anger at her casual mention of caring about Carlos and his family, but I forced myself to remain quiet and listen. This was her opportunity to explain herself, and I wanted to hear every word so that I could evaluate whether any of it was true. "So you decided to steal from elderly people to pay off your debts?" Prosecutor Reeves asked. "It wasn't supposed to be stealing," Lucia said, and for the first time, her composure cracked slightly. "I was looking for a way to borrow money, to find someone who might be willing to help me in exchange for future payments. I thought that maybe Mrs. Gonzalez, with her property and her late husband's insurance, might be able to help me." "By giving you access to her bank accounts and personal information?" "I was going to ask her," Lucia insisted, though even as she said it, I could see that she didn't believe her own words. I was building up the courage to explain the situation and ask for her help, but then she had the heart episode and everything went wrong. "Wrong how?" I asked, speaking for the first time since the initial pleasantries. Lucia looked directly at me through the camera, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine emotion in her eyes, though I couldn't tell if it was regret or simply fear of the consequences she was facing. "When we got to the hospital that night, I got a call from one of the men I owed money to. He said that they had been watching me, that they knew where I lived and worked, and that if I didn't have their money by the next morning, they were going to start with Carlos." She paused, seeming to gather herself before continuing. "They told me I had 12 hours to come up with $50,000, or they would hurt the people I loved. I panicked. I knew I couldn't get that kind of money legitimately. Not in 12 hours, so I started thinking about other options." "Such as?" Detective Morrison prompted. "I thought about the life insurance policies that Mrs. Gonzalez had mentioned, about the value of her house, about whether there might be a way to access some of that money quickly. But I also knew that even if she agreed to help me, which was far from certain, we couldn't liquidate that kind of asset overnight." "So you left her alone in the emergency room while you figured out how to steal from her," Prosecutor Reeves said, her voice sharp with disapproval. I left because I was scared and confused and trying to figure out how to protect my family, Lucia shot back. And for the first time, I heard the harder edge that had been in her voice during our phone conversation. I went home to gather some documents and to try to come up with a plan that didn't involve hurting anyone. What kind of documents? Detective Morrison asked. Lucia hesitated, glancing again at her off-camera lawyer. I had been collecting information about Mrs. Gonzalez's financial situation, just in case there was ever an emergency where she needed help managing her affairs. I thought that if I could show the loan sharks that there were assets that could be accessed eventually, they might be willing to give me more time. You were collecting her personal information to commit identity theft, Prosecutor Reeves corrected. I was trying to find a solution that would protect everyone, Lucia insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I found myself studying her face as she spoke, looking for any sign of the woman I had thought I knew, any hint of genuine remorse or authentic emotion. But what I saw instead was someone who was skilled at saying what she thought people wanted to hear, someone who had spent so much time manipulating others that she might no longer be capable of genuine honesty even with herself. Tell me about the other families, I said suddenly, interrupting the legal back and forth between Lucia and the prosecutor. Tell me about the other people you've done this to over the past 12 years. Lucia's expression changed, becoming more guarded and defensive. I don't know what you mean. Detective Morrison told me about the 7 families in 5 states, about the elderly man in Colorado who died after you emptied his bank account, about the families who lost their homes, their life savings, their trust in other people because of what you did to them. For a long moment, Lucia said nothing, and I could see her calculating how to respond, weighing the legal implications of admitting to other crimes against the potential benefits of appearing cooperative and remorseful. Those situations were different, she said finally. Each one had its own circumstances, its own complications. I never set out to hurt anyone, Mrs. Gonzalez. I was always trying to find solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve any other way. By stealing from people who trusted you, I said, and I could hear the anger creeping into my voice despite my efforts to remain calm. By lying to families who welcomed you into their homes and their hearts. I know how it looks, Lucia said, and her voice took on that pleading tone again. I know that from the outside, it seems like I was just a criminal taking advantage of good people. But you have to understand that I was trapped, that every choice I made was between bad options and worse options. What about the choice to be honest? Carlos spoke for the first time, his voice thick with emotion. What about the choice to tell me the truth about who you were and what kind of trouble you were in? What about the choice to ask for help instead of lying and stealing and planning to take my mother's identity? Lucia looked at him through the camera with an expression that might have been genuine pain, though by now I trusted nothing about her emotional displays. I was ashamed, Carlos. I was terrified that if you knew the truth about my past, about the mistakes I had made, you would leave me. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing you and your family. So instead, you decided to destroy us, Carlos said, and his voice was getting louder, more agitated. Instead of risking honesty, you chose manipulation and theft and abandonment. I chose survival, Lucia said, and for the first time, her mask of remorse slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. I chose the option that gave me the best chance of getting out of an impossible situation with my life intact. Even if it meant putting my mother's life at risk, Carlos said. I never intended for her to be in danger, Lucia insisted. But the conviction had gone out of her voice. You left her alone in an emergency room for 12 hours with a heart condition, Carlos continued, and I could see that his anger was building to a crescendo that might derail the entire conversation. You abandoned her when she was most vulnerable, and then you disappeared for weeks while she recovered, not knowing if you were dead or alive or simply didn't care. I cared, Lucia said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. If you cared, you would have called, Carlos said. If you cared, you would have made sure she was all right. If you cared, you wouldn't have been planning to steal her identity and take over her life. That wasn't what I was planning, Lucia said, but her protest lacked any real force. Then what were you planning? I asked, leaning forward and looking directly into the camera. What was the endgame, Lucia? Or should I call you Lisa? What exactly did you hope to accomplish by gathering all my personal information and learning everything about my financial situation? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options, trying to decide how much truth would serve her purposes and how much would only make her legal situation worse. I thought that if something happened to you naturally, if your heart condition got worse or if you had another episode, I might be able to help Carlos manage your affairs, she said finally. I knew he would be devastated if he lost you, and I thought I could take care of the practical details so he wouldn't have to deal with them while he was grieving. By assuming my identity and stealing my assets, I said, by making sure your wishes were carried out and your family was taken care of, she corrected. But even she seemed to realize how weak the justification sounded. What wishes? Prosecutor Reeves asked. Did Mrs. Gonzalez ever express any wishes about having you manage her affairs or take over her identity? Not explicitly, Lucia admitted. But she treated me like a daughter, and I thought that implied a certain level of trust and responsibility. It implied that I loved you, I said, and the words came out more quietly than I had intended. It implied that I welcomed you into my family and trusted you to care about our welfare. It had nothing to do with giving you permission to steal from me or to take my place if I died. For the first time since the conversation had begun, Lucia looked genuinely shaken. I know that now, she said. I know that I misunderstood the situation, that I let my desperation and fear cloud my judgment about what was right and what was necessary. You didn't misunderstand anything, I said, and I could feel my own anger finally breaking through the careful control I had been maintaining. You knew exactly what you were doing. You studied our family like a predator studies prey, learning our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities so you could exploit them when the time was right. That's not true, Lucia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then explain the other families, I said. Explain how you accidentally manipulated 7 different families over 12 years. Explain how you accidentally gathered personal information from elderly relatives and accidentally emptied their bank accounts and accidentally disappeared when they needed you most. Lucia was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, harder and more resigned. You want the truth, Mrs. Gonzalez? The truth is that I'm good at reading people, good at figuring out what they want to hear and what they need to believe about themselves and their relationships. I'm good at becoming the person that someone needs me to be, at least for as long as it serves my purposes. The honesty was startling in its coldness, but also strangely liberating. Finally, after months of lies and manipulation, I was hearing something that sounded like the truth from the woman who had systematically deceived my family. And what did you think we needed you to be? Carlos asked. You needed someone who would love you unconditionally, who would think you were wonderful exactly as you are, Lucia said, looking directly at him through the camera. Your mother needed someone who would appreciate her traditions and her wisdom, who would carry on her recipes and her values. Your family needed someone who would fit in seamlessly, who would become part of your history without disrupting your established dynamics. And none of that was real, Carlos said, and it wasn't a question. Some of it was real, Lucia said, and for the first time I heard something that might have been genuine regret in her voice. I did come to care about you, about your family. I did enjoy learning your mother's recipes and hearing your father's stories, but I also knew that those feelings were secondary to my primary goal, which was establishing myself in a position where I could access financial resources if I needed them. So even the caring was calculated, I said. Everything was calculated, Mrs. Gonzalez. That's how people like me survive. We learn to compartmentalize our emotions, to separate genuine feelings from strategic objectives. I could care about you and still plan to steal from you if the situation demanded it. The room was very quiet for a moment, as we all absorbed the implications of what she had just admitted. This wasn't the remorseful woman seeking forgiveness that her lawyers had probably coached her to portray. This was the real Lisa Cortez, the career criminal who had perfected the art of emotional manipulation over more than a decade of victimizing families like ours. "Why are you telling us this?" Detective Morrison asked. "Your lawyer must have advised you that these admissions could significantly damage your case." Lucia looked off camera again, presumably at her lawyer, and I could imagine the frantic signals he was probably sending her to stop talking. But when she looked back at us, there was something almost like relief in her expression. "Because I'm tired," she said simply. "I'm tired of lying. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Tired of manipulating people who deserve better. And because Mrs. Gonzalez deserves to know the truth about what happened to her family, even if that truth is ugly and painful." "What is the truth?" I asked. "The truth is that I selected your family specifically because you fit the profile of people who would be vulnerable to my particular type of manipulation." Carlos was lonely and eager to please, desperate for a relationship with someone who would appreciate him. You were widowed and aging, with significant assets but no immediate family to protect your interests. Your other children lived far away, and wouldn't be likely to interfere with my relationship with Carlos or with my access to family information. Each word felt like a physical blow, but I forced myself to listen, to hear every detail of how we had been evaluated and targeted, like livestock at an auction. "I spent months researching your family before I ever approached Carlos," Lucia continued. "I knew about your husband's construction business, about the life insurance money, about the value of your property. I knew about Carlos's employment history, his financial struggles, his previous relationships that had failed. I knew exactly what each of you needed to hear to trust me completely." "How did you research us?" Prosecutor Reeves asked. "Public records, social media, mutual acquaintances." Carlos's co-workers were happy to talk about his family, especially after I showed interest in hearing about his background. People love to share information about the people they care about, especially when they think they're helping someone understand and appreciate those people. "And the marriage?" Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was part of the plan from the beginning," Lucia said, and I could see Carlos flinch as if she had struck him. "I needed legal access to family information, needed to establish myself as a legitimate member of the household so that I could gather the documentation I would eventually need." "The 4 years we were together," Carlos pressed, "were the longest con I had ever attempted," Lucia said. "Most of my previous operations were completed within 18 months, but your family was more complex, more cautious. It took longer to establish the level of trust I needed to access the really valuable information." I felt a strange sense of vindication mixed with the pain of having our naivety confirmed so explicitly. We had been right to sense that something was off about Lucia, right to feel that some of her behavior didn't quite add up, but we had been wrong to ignore those instincts, wrong to prioritize politeness and hope over the evidence of our own observations. "What about the night at the hospital?" I asked. "Was that planned?" "No," Lucia said, and for the first time she sounded completely honest. "That was improvisation." When I got the call from the loan sharks that night, I realized that my timeline had been accelerated, that I was going to have to move much faster than I had planned. "I left you at the hospital because I needed time to decide whether to abandon the operation entirely or to accelerate it dramatically." "Meaning what?" "Meaning I had to decide whether to disappear immediately and start over somewhere else with a new identity, or to stay and try to complete the plan I had been working on for 4 years. And you chose to disappear. I chose survival, Lucia said again. I realized that the situation had become too complicated, too risky. There were too many variables I couldn't control, too many people who might become suspicious if something happened to you too conveniently after your hospital visit. So you abandoned an elderly woman with a heart condition because it was inconvenient to your criminal plans, Prosecutor Reeves summarized. I made a decision based on self-preservation, Lucia said, and her voice had gone cold again. It wasn't personal, Mrs. Gonzalez. It was just business. The phrase hit me like a slap, reducing 4 years of what I had believed was genuine family relationship to a business transaction. A long-term investment that had failed to pay off as expected. I thought about all the holidays we had shared, all the conversations about family and tradition and love, all the moments when I had felt grateful to have gained such a caring daughter-in-law. All of it had been just business to her. I think we've heard enough, Carlos said, standing up abruptly from his chair. I think we understand exactly what kind of person we're dealing with. But I wasn't ready to end the conversation yet. There was one more question that I needed answered, one more piece of the puzzle that would help me understand how completely I had been deceived. Was any of it real? I asked. Any moment, any conversation, any expression of care or affection? Was there ever a time when you genuinely cared about us as people rather than as targets? Lucia was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her weighing how to answer, whether to offer me the comfort of believing that some small part of our relationship had been authentic. There were moments, she said finally. When you were teaching me your grandmother's tamale recipe. When you told me stories about your husband and how much you missed him. When you included me in your prayers and your family traditions. There were moments when I forgot why I was there, when I got caught up in the warmth and the acceptance and the feeling of belonging somewhere. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than it had been throughout the entire conversation. But those moments were always temporary, she said. They were always overruled by the knowledge that I was there for a purpose, that your kindness and trust were tools that I could use to achieve my objectives. I couldn't afford to let genuine feelings interfere with my survival. So even the genuine moments were corrupted by your deception, I said. Yes, she said simply. Everything was corrupted by my deception, including my own ability to experience authentic emotions about the people I was manipulating. I sat back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of completion. This was the truth I had needed to hear, painful as it was. Not the comfortable lie that she had genuinely cared about us, but had been forced into desperate measures by circumstances beyond her control, but the harder truth that we had been marks in a long-term criminal operation, that our love and trust had been commodities to be exploited. I want you to know something, I said, looking directly into the camera so that she would be forced to see my face as I spoke. I want you to know that despite everything you've done, despite all the lies and manipulation and betrayal, you haven't broken us. Our family is still strong, still intact, still capable of love and trust and hope. I'm glad, Lucia said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. And I want you to know that I will testify at your trial, I continued. I will tell the court exactly what you did to us, exactly how you exploited our trust and abandoned me when I was vulnerable, and I will make sure that the judge understands that your crimes weren't victimless, that they caused real pain to real people who deserved better. I understand, Lucia said. And Mrs. Gonzalez? For whatever it's worth, I am sorry. Not because I got caught, not because I'm facing prison time, but because you deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved a daughter-in-law who would have loved you genuinely, who would have been there for you when you needed her most. Yes, I said. We did deserve better. And the next time my family opens their hearts to someone, they'll be more careful about making sure that person deserves the gift they're being offered. I stood up from the table, feeling suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. I think we're done here." As the video conference ended and Lucia's face disappeared from the screen, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pain, certainly, at having my worst fears about her confirmed so explicitly. Anger at the calculated nature of her deception and the casual way she had dismissed our suffering. But also something like relief at finally knowing the truth, at no longer having to wonder about her motivations or question my own perceptions of what had happened. Carlos was crying openly now, and I went to him and held him the way I had when he was a child, and the world had disappointed him. But this disappointment was deeper, more fundamental, touching on his basic trust in other people and his faith in his own judgment. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he said through his tears. "I'm sorry I brought her into our family. I'm sorry I trusted her. I'm sorry I didn't see what she really was." "You loved someone who presented herself as worthy of love," I said, stroking his hair and feeling my own heart break for the pain he was experiencing. "That's not something to apologize for. That's something to be proud of, even when the love isn't returned in the way we hoped." "But I should have protected you," he said. "I should have seen the signs, should have asked more questions, should have been more suspicious." "We both saw what we wanted to see," I said. "And what we wanted to see was someone who would love our family the way we loved her. That's not naivety, mijo. That's hope. And hope is not something we should be ashamed of, even when it's disappointed." As we left the police station and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in me during that conversation. The woman who had been abandoned in the emergency room, who had spent weeks feeling confused and betrayed and vulnerable, was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what had happened to her family and who was prepared to fight back with all the strength and determination that 73 years of survival had taught her. Lucia had made a critical error in her assessment of the Gonzalez family. She had seen our capacity for love and trust as weaknesses to be exploited, but she had failed to understand that those same qualities were also sources of strength, that people who love deeply also fight fiercely when the people they love are threatened. The trial was still months away, but I was ready for it. I was ready to stand up in court and tell the world exactly what Lisa Cortez had done to our family. I was ready to make sure that she faced the full consequences of her crimes, and that other families would be protected from her manipulations. Most importantly, I was ready to reclaim the narrative of my own life, to refuse to be remembered as the elderly victim who was abandoned in an emergency room, and to insist on being recognized as the woman who survived that abandonment and fought back against the person who had tried to destroy her family's faith in love and trust and hope. The heart monitor in the hospital had tracked the rhythm of a heart that was healing, but now I could feel the stronger rhythm of a heart that had been tested and had emerged not broken, but fiercer and more determined than ever before. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews when we arrived on the morning of Lisa Cortez's sentencing. 8 months had passed since that video conference where she had finally admitted the truth about her systematic deception of our family, and the intervening time had been filled with legal proceedings, victim impact statements, and the slow process of rebuilding our lives around the knowledge of what had really happened to us. Carlos walked beside me, his arm linked, through mine for support, though I wasn't sure which of us needed the steadying more. The trial itself had concluded 3 weeks earlier with guilty verdicts on all 17 counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy that had been brought against Lisa. But today was sentencing day, the moment when the judge would decide how many years she would spend in prison for the damage she had inflicted on 9 families across 6 states. I had testified during the trial, spending 2 days on the witness stand recounting the details of that night in the emergency room, the months of manipulation that had preceded it, and the devastating impact that Lisa's abandonment and deception had had on our family. It had been emotionally exhausting, but also strangely liberating to finally tell our story in a forum where truth mattered more than manipulation, where Lisa's skills at emotional manipulation were irrelevant in the face of documented evidence and multiple victim testimonies. Detective Morrison met us at the courthouse entrance, his familiar presence a comfort after the months we had spent working together to build the case against Lisa. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Gonzalez?" he asked as we made our way through the metal detectors and into the building's marble-lined lobby. "Ready," I said, and I meant it. This day represented the end of a chapter that had begun with my chest pain during evening prayers and had led me through betrayal, abandonment, and the gradual discovery of truths that had shattered everything I thought I knew about trust and family and love. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, reporters, law enforcement officials, and curious members of the public who had followed the case through the extensive media coverage it had received. Lisa's case had become something of a sensation, particularly after prosecutors had revealed the full scope of her 12-year criminal career and the sophisticated methods she had used to target and manipulate vulnerable families. I took my seat in the front row reserved for victims, surrounded by people whose stories echoed my own in heartbreaking ways. There was Margaret Chen, the widow from Colorado whose husband had died of a heart attack after discovering that Lisa had emptied their retirement account. There was Robert Martinez from Nevada, whose elderly mother had signed over power of attorney to Lisa before disappearing with $60,000 in savings. There was the Thompson family from Oregon, who had lost their family farm after Lisa convinced them to take out a reverse mortgage and then vanished with the proceeds. Each of these families had welcomed Lisa into their lives under different names and slightly different circumstances, but the pattern was always the same. She would identify vulnerable targets through careful research, establish herself as trustworthy, and caring through months of patient relationship building, gradually gather access to financial information and resources, and then disappear when the situation became too risky or when she had extracted as much value as possible. What made our case unusual was not the scope of her deception, but the fact that she had abandoned her operation before completing it. In every other instance, she had successfully stolen significant amounts of money before disappearing. With C, our family, she had fled empty-handed after 4 years of preparation, leaving behind a trail of evidence that had ultimately led to her capture and the unraveling of her entire criminal enterprise. The prosecution had built their case around the argument that Lisa was a career criminal who had perfected a system of emotional manipulation and financial fraud that she had used repeatedly to destroy families and steal their life savings. They had presented evidence showing how she had assumed multiple identities, created false employment histories, and even staged fake emergencies to justify her sudden disappearances when operations went wrong. Lisa's defense team had tried to portray her as a victim of circumstances, someone who had been forced into criminal behavior by abusive relationships and desperate financial situations. They had presented testimony about her troubled childhood, her history of domestic violence, and the gambling addiction that had led to her initial debts to dangerous creditors. But the prosecution had systematically dismantled this narrative by showing the calculated nature of her crimes, the sophisticated planning that went into each operation, and the complete lack of remorse she had shown for the devastation she had caused to her victims. The video conference where she had admitted that our family relationship was just business had been particularly damaging to her case, showing the jury exactly how coldly she viewed the people whose lives she had destroyed. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock, her black robes and serious expression commanding immediate silence from the packed gallery. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and she had a reputation for being both fair and uncompromising when it came to crimes that targeted vulnerable populations. Lisa was brought in wearing a gray suit that her lawyers had undoubtedly chosen to make her appear more sympathetic, but the orange jail wristband and the deputy sheriff at her side made it clear that she was no longer the polished professional woman who had sat at my kitchen table learning family recipes. She looked older, more worn down by the months of incarceration and legal proceedings, but her eyes still carried that calculating quality that I had learned to recognize as her true nature. "Before I announce the sentence," Judge Hawkins said, consulting the papers spread before her on the bench, "I want to address the scope and impact of the crimes that have been proven in this case. Ms. Cortez, you have been convicted of a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that spans more than a decade and has caused immeasurable harm to multiple families across multiple states." The judge's voice was measured and professional, but there was an undercurrent of controlled anger that suggested she understood exactly what kind of damage Lisa had inflicted on her victims. "The evidence presented during this trial shows that you deliberately targeted vulnerable individuals and families, that you used sophisticated manipulation techniques to gain their trust and access their personal information, and that you showed complete disregard for the emotional and financial devastation that your actions caused." Judge Hawkins looked directly at Lisa, who was standing at the defendant's table with her hands folded in front of her and her head slightly bowed in what was probably meant to convey remorse, but came across as calculation about how to appear most sympathetic. "The court has received dozens of victim impact statements that detail the profound and lasting harm that your actions have caused. Families have lost their life savings, their homes, their sense of security, and in some cases, their faith in other human beings. Elderly victims have been left not only financially devastated, but emotionally traumatized by the betrayal of someone they trusted as family." The judge paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "The court has also considered the arguments presented by your defense team regarding your personal history and the circumstances that may have contributed to your criminal behavior. While the court acknowledges that you may have experienced trauma and hardship in your own life, that history does not excuse or justify the deliberate and systematic victimization of innocent families." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Judge Hawkins for refusing to accept the narrative that Lisa was somehow as much a victim as the families she had destroyed. Too often, I had seen criminals receive lighter sentences because their lawyers successfully portrayed their illegal actions as understandable responses to difficult circumstances. "Ms. Cortez," Judge Hawkins said, "do you have anything you would like to say before I announce your sentence?" Lisa stood up slowly, glancing briefly at her lawyer before looking toward the judge. For a moment, I thought she might offer a genuine apology, some acknowledgement of the pain she had caused that wasn't filtered through legal strategy and self-interest. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but quiet, "I want to say that I take full responsibility for my actions and for the harm I have caused to the families who trusted me. I know that my words cannot undo the damage I have done, but I want everyone to know that I am truly sorry for the pain I have caused." It was exactly the kind of statement that her lawyers would have coached her to deliver, full of appropriate words about responsibility and remorse, but lacking any specific acknowledgement of the scope of her crimes or genuine understanding of their impact. Even now, facing years in prison, she was still performing, still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. "I grew up in poverty and abuse," she continued, "and I learned early that survival sometimes required making choices that I'm not proud of. Over time, those survival mechanisms became a way of life, and I lost sight of the difference between protecting myself and hurting other people." Judge Hawkins listened without expression, but I could see that she was not impressed by this attempt to frame Lisa's criminal career as an understandable response to childhood trauma. "I want the families I hurt to know that I think about them every day, that I understand the trust they placed in me and how completely I violated that trust. I hope that someday I can find a way to make amends for what I have done, though I know that day may never come." Lisa sat down, and the courtroom remained silent as Judge Hawkins reviewed her notes one final time before announcing the sentence. "Ms. Cortez," the judge said, "the court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. You will also be required to pay restitution to your victims in the amount of $473,000, representing the documented financial losses caused by your criminal actions. A collective gasp went through the courtroom at the length of the sentence. Even the prosecutors seemed surprised by the severity of Judge Hawkins's decision, though I could see satisfaction on their faces at this validation of the seriousness of Lisa's crimes. In determining this sentence, Judge Hawkins continued, "The court has considered the systematic nature of your criminal behavior, the vulnerability of your victims, the sophisticated planning that went into your crimes, and the complete lack of genuine remorse you have shown throughout these proceedings." The judge looked directly at Lisa again, her expression stern and unforgiving. "The court finds that you represent a continuing danger to society, particularly to elderly and vulnerable individuals who might be targeted by your manipulation techniques. The length of this sentence reflects not only the need for punishment and deterrence, but also the need to protect the public from further victimization." Lisa showed no visible reaction to the sentence, though I could see her lawyer leaning over to whisper something in her ear, probably about appeals and the possibility of reducing the sentence through various legal mechanisms. But for me, sitting in that courtroom surrounded by other victims who had suffered similar betrayals, the sentence felt like validation that what had happened to us mattered, that the pain and confusion and loss of trust we had experienced were real and significant, and deserving of serious consequences. After the formal proceedings concluded and Lisa was led away in handcuffs to begin serving her sentence, the victims and their families gathered in the courthouse lobby to talk about what the conclusion of the case meant for their ongoing recovery and healing. Margaret Chen approached me with tears in her eyes, taking my hands in hers with a grip that conveyed both gratitude and shared understanding of what we had all endured. "Thank you for testifying," she said. "Thank you for having the courage to stand up and tell the truth about what she did to your family." "We all deserve to have our stories heard," I replied. "We all deserve to have someone acknowledge that what happened to us was wrong and that it caused real damage to real people." Robert Martinez nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. 22 years, he said. "She'll be in her 50s when she gets out, if she serves the full sentence. Maybe by then she'll be too old to start over with the same kind of criminal operation. Or maybe she'll have learned new techniques from other criminals in prison," said Janet Thompson, whose family had lost their farm to Lisa's manipulations. "People like her don't usually change. They just adapt their methods to new circumstances." Detective Morrison joined our group, his expression reflecting both professional satisfaction at seeing a major case concluded successfully and personal understanding of what this outcome meant for the families who had been victimized. "This case is going to be studied by law enforcement agencies across the country," he said. "Lisa's methods were sophisticated enough that we're already using the evidence from her crimes to train other investigators about how to recognize and investigate similar patterns of fraud and manipulation. So at least some good will come from what happened to us," Carlos said, speaking for the first time since the sentencing had been announced. "I think a lot of good has already come from what happened," I said, looking around at the group of people who had become something like an extended family through our shared experience of victimization and recovery. "We found each other, we supported each other through the legal process, and we showed that people like Lisa can't destroy us if we refuse to be destroyed." As we left the courthouse and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt a sense of completion that had been building slowly over the months since Lisa's arrest. The legal case was finished, justice had been served as fully as the system allowed, and now we could focus on the more important work of continuing to heal and rebuild the trust that had been damaged by her betrayals. Carlos and I drove home, in comfortable silence, both of us processing the emotions that the sentencing had stirred up. When we reached my house, the small place that Roberto had built for us so many years ago and that Lisa had been planning to claim for herself, Carlos helped me out of the car and walked me to the front door. "Are you going to be all right, Mommy?" he asked, and I could hear in his voice the ongoing concern that had marked his behavior toward me since that night in the emergency room. "I'm going to be fine," I said, and for the first time in months, I truly meant it. We're all going to be fine. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, looking around at the familiar objects and surfaces that had been part of my daily life for decades. The same yellow curtains that had filtered the morning light on the day Detective Morrison called with news of Lisa's arrest. The same wooden table where she had sat learning my grandmother's recipes while secretly planning to assume my identity. The same photographs on the refrigerator showing family gatherings where she had smiled and posed as if she truly belonged with us. But instead of feeling violated by these memories, I felt something closer to peace. Lisa had been in my life for 4 years, but she had never really been part of my life. She had been an actor playing a role, a criminal executing a long-term plan, a predator studying her prey. But she had never been family, despite all the ways we had tried to include her in our family's story. The real story of the Gonzalez family was about love and resilience and the strength that comes from facing hardship together. It was about Roberto building this house with his own hands, about raising 3 children as a single mother, about surviving loss and disappointment and betrayal without losing the capacity to trust and hope and love again. Lisa's story was about deception and manipulation and the emptiness that comes from viewing other people as opportunities to be exploited rather than human beings deserving of respect and care. Her story had intersected with ours for a while, had caused us pain and confusion and loss, but it had not become our story. My phone rang, interrupting my quiet reflection, and I smiled when I saw Elena's number on the caller ID. She had been calling regularly since Lisa's arrest, checking on my emotional state and making sure I was processing everything in a healthy way. "How was the sentencing, Mommy?" she asked as soon as I answered. 22 years, I said. The judge was very clear about why Lisa deserved such a long sentence. "Good," Elena said, and I could hear the fierce satisfaction in her voice. "I hope she serves every single day of it. I hope she uses the time to figure out how to become a better person," I said, and I was surprised to realize that I meant it. After everything she did to you, to Carlos, to all those other families, you can still hope for her redemption? "I hope for everyone's redemption," I said. "Not because they deserve it, but because redemption is always better than the alternative. The world is better when people learn to choose love over manipulation, trust over deception, genuine connection over exploitation." "You're a better person than I am," Elena said. "I'm not sure I could be so generous towards someone who had hurt my family the way she hurt yours." "I'm not being generous," I said. "I'm being practical. Carrying anger and hatred takes energy that I'd rather spend on other things. Lisa took enough from our family. I'm not going to let her take my peace of mind, too." After we finished talking, I walked through my small house, turning off lights and checking locks in the nighttime routine that had comforted me for decades. In my bedroom, I stopped in front of the dresser where I kept Roberto's photograph, and the small altar where I still said my evening prayers. The candle that I lit each night had been burning when my chest pain started, beginning the chain of events that had led to Lisa's abandonment and eventual exposure. Tonight, as I lit a new candle and knelt in front of the familiar images, I felt grateful rather than fearful. Grateful that my heart had been strong enough to survive both the medical crisis and the emotional trauma that had followed. Grateful that Carlos had found the courage to report Lisa's disappearance and cooperate with the investigation. Grateful that Detective Morrison and the prosecutors had taken our case seriously and worked tirelessly to seek justice for all of Lisa's victims. Most of all, grateful that our family's capacity for love had survived intact despite being tested in ways we had never imagined possible. "Thank you, Roberto," I whispered to his photograph. "Thank you for building us a strong foundation that could weather this storm. Thank you for teaching our children to value honesty and loyalty and genuine connection with other people." As I prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would mark exactly 1 year since that night in the emergency room when Lisa had abandoned me and begun the process that would ultimately lead to her downfall. A year ago, I had been a woman who trusted easily and believed the best about people until given reason to doubt them. Tonight, I was a woman who had learned to trust more carefully and to recognize the difference between genuine care and skillful manipulation. Both versions of myself had value, but I preferred the woman I had become through surviving this ordeal. She was wiser, stronger, and more appreciative of authentic relationships because she understood how rare and precious they truly were. The heart monitor in the hospital had tracked the rhythm of a heart that was healing from medical trauma. But tonight, as I drifted off to sleep in the house that Roberto had built, and that I had successfully defended from someone who had tried to steal it, I could feel the stronger rhythm of a heart that had healed from something much more serious than blocked arteries. I had healed from the betrayal of trust, from the violation of family bonds, from the discovery that someone I had loved as a daughter had viewed me as nothing more than a business opportunity. And in healing from those deeper wounds, I had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and a resilience that would serve me well in whatever challenges the future might bring. Lisa Cortez had made the mistake of thinking that Maria Gonzalez would be an easy victim, that an elderly widow would be too weak or too isolated to fight back effectively. She had been wrong about the woman she had chosen to target, wrong about the family she had tried to destroy, and wrong about the consequences she would face for underestimating the strength that comes from genuine love and authentic connection with other people. The sentence of 22 years was not just punishment for her crimes, but validation that families like ours matter, that trust is sacred, and that people who build their lives on deception and manipulation will ultimately face the consequences of their choices. As sleep finally claimed me, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of peace and resolution. It had been a difficult year, full of pain and confusion and hard-won wisdom, but it had also been a year of discovering that the foundations Roberto and I had built for our family were strong enough to withstand even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to choose love over fear, trust over suspicion, hope over cynicism. But tonight, I rested in the knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged, in the house that love had built, surrounded by the prayers and memories and unshakable bonds that no amount of deception could ever truly touch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.